Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Keating, and this is my channel, Dr. Erinnerung, where I talk about pop culture content related to my teaching and my research. And I'm very excited for what I'm talking about today. It's something I've been thinking about and working on a while, and I've got to teach a number of times. And that is whether there can be an asexual Gothic. So before we get there, a couple of sort of businessy things. If you haven't already, and you sort of are enjoying what I do, enjoying watching the videos, please like and subscribe. Also, this one may be a bit long, so I have put in chapter breaks just in case there's particular parts that you're more interested in. There will be spoilers later, but there aren't for this early part of the video. And so I will definitely let you know when the spoilers are coming, and also it's written below the timestamp when they start. This video is going to use Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children's series to think about whether the Gothic can be compatible with asexuality, whether there is such thing perhaps as an asexual Gothic. And before I get to that sort of main core of what I'm exploring and thinking about, and hopefully, the reason you clicked on this video, I want to lay out a little bit of groundwork in terms of a background to the Gothic, and also a background to sort of asexuality and how that might fit within the Gothic tradition and how it has fit within criticism about the Gothic so far in terms of sort of academic discourse. So I'm going to dive right in to just a bit of a background about the Gothic in theory. So if you're watching this, chances are you're familiar with the Gothic as a genre and as a mode that shows up in related genres, right? Like fantasy and horror and even sci-fi. And as Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick puts it in her early attempt to delineate what we mean by the Gothic, quote, "Once you know that a novel is of the Gothic kind, you can predict its content with an unnerving certainty." And of course, all of my full info is down below for anything I quote in this video. And so the Gothic is a genre that has been long associated with a particular set of tropes, which is, this is no surprise to those of you who are fans of the form. And so certain tropes, settings, characters, and themes pretty much since its inception in the English literary tradition in 1764 with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which explicitly referred to itself as a Gothic story on the cover of its second edition. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. It reads very strangely, I think, to 21st century eyes, and often comic even at times, but it's a brilliant short novel. So again, I'm going to turn to Sedgwick to describe sort of the qualities that Gothic readers are expecting when they see sort of that term on their books, on their readings. And so the settings will include, quote, an oppressive room, a wild landscape, a Catholic or feudal society. As sort of Sedgwick says, as a reader, you know about the trembling sensibility of the heroine, the impetuosity of her lover. You know about the tyrannical older man with the piercing glance who's going to imprison and try to rape or murder them. You also know that, certain characteristic preoccupations will be aired. And these include the priesthood and monastic institutions, sleep-like and death-like states, subterranean spaces and live burial, doubles, and of course, if you think of twins there, of course, as well. A lot of contemporary Gothic, very obsessed with twins. The discovery of obscured family ties, affinities between narrative and pictorial art, possibilities of incest, unnatural echoes or silences, unintelligible writings, and the unspeakable, garrulous retainers, the poison effects of guilt and shame, nocturnal landscapes and dreams, apparitions from the past, Faust and wandering Jew-like figures, civil insurrections and fires, the charnel house, and the madhouse. So that's a very, long list of qualities that have been associated with the Gothic for a long time. And certainly I imagine there's others that you can think of if you are a fan of the form that tend to show up sort of over and over again. The Gothic, if you will, is haunted by these in various ways. And certainly if you've read any early Gothic fiction, like say Matthew Lewis's The Monk, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, if you haven't, I highly recommend them, you'll recognize those features, right? And not all Gothic novels have all of them, but they draw almost from that, right? And likely you're also able to call to mind, stuff that's not included here that may have become more popular in the 21st century, as the Gothic has certainly changed, but we're very much in a moment, right, of Gothic revival that is encompassing most popular media. And those elements of the Gothic that Sedgwick identifies are still very much found in current Gothic media, like, for instance, C.G. Drew's Don't Let the Forest In, which I am currently obsessed with, and perhaps there may be a video on coming in the future. Or, of course, the many television series and films featuring the figure of the vampire, right? And just to name like a couple of things. So there's just something about the Gothic that has kept it endlessly fascinating for readers and viewers over centuries, as it continually takes on new life in different national, cultural, and historical contexts. There are also a wealth of scholars who work on the Gothic, and if you're a fan and have access to a good library, I'd strongly encourage you to look into just the many companions to the Gothic that have been published in the past 20 years, and in particular the Edinburgh Guides to the Gothic series that has volumes dedicated to a variety of different elements of Gothic, like women in Gothic, queer Gothic, Gothic in theory, 21st century Gothic, to name just a few. And so there's this wide realm of scholarship out there if it's something that you're interested in diving into and finding more of. And sometimes you can find those types of companion things also at used bookstores, as students might buy them for classes and then end up selling them, particularly if you're in a university town. So most scholars agree that fundamentally the Gothic is a genre of transgression, and by extension of thresholds, and that because of its transgressive relationship to the rules and norms that dominate its time in society, the Gothic is a genre that is essentially queer, right? So this emphasis in most criticism really likes to think about how the Gothic is informed by its current environment and how it's responding to that environment in various ways. So that's Sara, Faber, and Kerstin-Anja Münderlein, the editors of the 2024 collection Rethinking the Gothic, Transgressions of Gender and Sexuality, describe it this way, quote, Gothic aesthetics, and particularly Gothic excesses, often go against the grain and provide an outlet for social and cultural anxieties. Gothic does not aim for straightforward meaning, but rather forces its readers to accept ambiguities and transgressive ideas. Transgressive in the sense that these ideas run counter to socially and aesthetically accepted or prescribed rules. David Punter also highlights transgression in recent Gothic fiction, writing, quote, Gothic is all about transgression, and thus it is also all about the threshold, the point at which one might cross from the inside to the outside, from the home into the outer world, from, to quote Freud on the uncanny, the homely to the unhomely, only to discover, of course, that they are one and the same. So, in other words, the transgressions of the Gothic, right, they're both social in terms of social norms and rules, and personal in terms of sort of working out one's own repressions, identities, relationship to that society, right? So both against the society and against the strict boundaries that are placed by that society upon the individual body and the individual psyche. I want to bring that more explicitly into queer theory, to see sort of just how that's played out a little bit before we go into thinking about asexuality in the Gothic. So in his foundational study, Queer Gothic, George Hagerty argues that the Gothic genre is not just concerned with representing transgressive sexualities and with breaking established rules and norms, but rather was actually fundamental in shaping Western understandings of sexuality, acting as a, quote, testing ground for many unauthorized genders and sexualities. He goes on to define the Gothic as, at its root, quote, about the fact of desire itself. As we can see from the 2023 Edinburgh Companion entirely on queer Gothic, this is still an influential view of the Gothic genre with an understanding of queerness that encompasses both sexualities as well as an understanding of queer as that which defies the dominant norms of a society, which might be like temporal, reproductive, or racial, for example, and queerness basically as resistant to cultural hegemonies and to social norms. And of course, if you've seen any of my videos on sort of queer theory and Malazan, I talk a lot in those videos about basically pushing back against reproductive futurism and heteronormativity. And so there's a bit more sort of theory there if you're interested in that sort of thing, around this expansive understanding of queerness that's a part of queer theory in an academic setting. So that's a little background on Gothic and Gothic criticism, but what about asexuality in the Gothic? Because with its emphasis on excessive desire and transgressive sexualities, it may be hard to see where the A in LGBTQIA+ or asexuality fits in that essential relationship that critics, authors, and readers alike see between queerness and the Gothic. And while this emphasis may on its surface seem to disqualify asexuality as one of its unauthorized sexualities, I would argue that unauthorized desires are not necessarily sexual in nature. And again, Drew's depiction of asexual longing and desire in Don't Let the Forest In is an interesting and monstrous exploration of that. Last example from that book. I promise that definitely need another video. Great book if you haven't read it. But also, in a hypersexualized society like 21st century North America, asexuality can be seen as perhaps the ultimate transgression or outright rejection of society's social norms. But is it Gothic? So before we get into that specifically, which I promise it's coming when we talk about McGuire's series, I do need to clarify two terms that I'm using throughout the following discussion just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. And that's the terms asexuality, which of course I've already been using, and compulsory sexuality. So the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, AVEN for short, defines asexual as, quote, describing someone who does not experience sexual attraction or an intrinsic desire to have sexual relationships. In the Encyclopedia of Sex and Gender, Eric Kellerman usefully distinguishes asexuality from celibacy, writing that, quote, celibacy and chastity described acts and choices, whereas asexuality describes desire, or rather, indifference. He also goes on to, quote, note that lack of interest in sex does not mean a lack of romantic involvement or amorous feelings, right? So a person may be both asexual and aromantic, but they can also be a romantic asexual or an aromantic allosexual, right? So there's a lot sort of going on in terms of this identity, and it is very much an umbrella identity. Note that this is still sort of very much a site of discourse in asexuality studies, and there's still a lot of negotiation about what it means to be asexual in our contemporary society, both in terms of critical discourse, but also in terms of popular discourse, right? By people just have lived experiences of asexuality and the different identities that fall within that. To move on to compulsory sexuality. Christina Gupta defines compulsory sexuality as the, quote, assumption that all people are sexual. So also using the term structurally, quote, to describe the social norms and practices that both marginalize various forms of non-sexuality, such as a lack of sexual desire or behavior, and compel people to experience themselves as desiring subjects, to take up sexual identities and engage in sexual activity, right? So this idea, really, if we think about both of these things, you have on the one side this sort of umbrella term, and which is a sexuality, right, of a lot of different sexualities within that, but basically not the normative relationship to sexual desire. And that's the key, right? Not sexual pleasure or libido, but sexual attraction is the key distinction being made there. And so you have that sort of on the one side, and on the other side, the sort of social, structural, compulsory sexuality, in that all of us sort of are assumed to be sexually a sexual being, right? Assumed to want to have that as our identity, as an integral part of our identity, and also assumed to feel attraction to someone, right? Of maybe both genders, opposite genders, same genders, whatever, right? But this idea that if you don't feel that type of attraction, something is wrong with you, right? It becomes medicalized. And sort of notions of frigidity, and there's all sort of a whole history of asexual people being medicalized by society and being told that something is wrong with them, right, if they don't conform to this. And so that is what compulsory sexuality means, right? It's this idea that we all must be sexual, want to be sexual, find the sexual one of the most important parts of our identity and lives, or there's something wrong with us. So go back to the critics. In an environment of compulsory sexuality, which North America very much is, asexuality fits well in Ardel Haefele-Thomas's description of the Gothic as, quote, thriving on liminal spaces, marginalized situations, non-normative characters, and taboo practices, in the introduction to the Edinburgh Companion to Queer Gothic. It also seems appropriate for S. Brooke Cameron's use of the term queer in relation to the Gothic as, quote, an identity category against which heterosexuality must define itself by naming what it is not or what is tabooed. Despite seemingly fitting within that, neither of these scholars, nor honestly most scholars working in the queer Gothic right now, I've encountered one or two, most don't include asexuality in their work, right? And I'm not pointing in these gaps to criticize people who are doing valuable work on queer Gothic, right? But rather to point out asexuality's continuing illegibility, right? Invisibility, even within the discourses of queer theory and the criticism of a genre that is viewed as fundamentally queer. And it's sort of a space where you might expect a place for asexual people. It's these very assumptions of the Gothic as fundamentally about specifically sexual desire that I think McGuire's playing with in the first 4 novellas of her series that feature the asexual ghost girlie named Nancy and the twin girls Jack and Jill, the mad scientist and the aspiring vampire, respectively. These characters work in concert to make visible an asexual Gothic, resisting our assumptions about the hypersexuality of the Gothic genre. However, to keep this video to a reasonable length, I'm going to focus on Nancy today, and perhaps do a second video on Jack and Jill if y'all are interested in that. We'll see sort of how that goes. Briefly, for those of you not familiar with the Wayward children's series, the novellas tell us stories of children and teens who have found doorways to other worlds that are more suited to their identities than ours, but who, for a variety of reasons, have been sent back to our world and are struggling to cope with families and in a society that refuses to recognize their experiences as anything other than compensatory fictions constructed to repress trauma, right? Like all of their parents and friends and whatnot think that these stories of going to other worlds are fictions that were created to repress some horrible experience that has happened in our world. So McGuire's drawing in this on portal, quest, and boarding school fantasy genres, of course, as well as Gothic fiction and film. She's intentional in her heavy use of intertext and allusion to create her worlds, right? Both at the school, which is where these children have gathered, and through the doorways throughout the series. So again, I'm focusing mostly on the first book, Every Hearted Doorway, for this video. Though I will begin the spoiler section with 2 Gothic tableaux from the second book, Down Among the Sticks and Bones, just to really establish the Gothic's role in this series as a whole. So, spoilers. Here comes spoilers, mostly very strongly for the first book, and just some details from the second that you may or may not consider spoilers. So well into the second book of Seanan McGuire's Wayward children's series, the narrator interrupts the story with a reflection on the mundane Gothic, noting their reader's desire for story, whether it be wild adventure or cautionary tale. The narrator resists that desire using a phrasal temporal strategy of deferral, the thrice repeated "and yet," before offering us 2 Gothic tableaus of the novel's heroines, Jacqueline and Gillian, or Jack and Jill, obviously a reference, right, to the nursery rhyme. And I want to take a moment to read both of these tableaux, because however mundane maybe the Gothic may have become to 21st century readers, I still take a great deal of pleasure in its atmospheric details, in the things that sort of make up its landscape and tone. And I hope you do as well if you're here watching this video. So first with Jill. And yet look to the castle on the bluffs, the castle near to the sea, which sits atop a crumbling cliff in the belly of the lowlands. Look to the castle where the golden-haired girl walks the battlements at dusk and dawn in her dresses like dreams, with her throat concealed from prying eyes, with the wind tying beautiful knots in the long curtain of her hair. She waxes and wanes like the moon, now pale as milk, now healthy and pink as any village girl. There are those in the village below who whisper that she is the master's daughter, sired on a princess from a faraway land and finally returned to her father when he howled her name to the western winds. And the master, as some of you may know, is a vampire, right? So this, behind this paleness versus rosiness, is whether he has been feeding on her lately, right? But like, note these Gothic details as well, right? It's not just about the vampire and the paleness. It's also that sort of very 19th century romantic Gothic, right, of Wuthering Heights and and sort of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, right? That sort of the landscape, the castle, the wind, the beautiful heroine sort of thing, although Jill is a bit complicated in that position, which perhaps some of you know. Now listen to the tableau of Jack, who's Jill's twin sister, and of course, twins, right? Again, that doubling, that's so much of interest to the Gothic. Quote, "And yet look to the windmill in the hills, the windmill on the moors, which stands higher than anything around it, inviting lightning, tempting disaster. Look to the windmill where the golden-haired girl works in the soil at all hours of the day and night. She toils without cease, burns her sleeves on smoking machinery, strains her eyes peering into the finest workings of the universe." Right? And sort of note some of the details here, right? You have the moor, you have this windmill, you have lightning hitting the windmill. And of course, if you've read this, you know that lightning is associated with travel between worlds, is associated with bringing people back to life, right? And so this is also 19th century Gothic in a lot of ways, but more influenced by a sort of Mary Shelley scientific Gothic stream of that time. For many readers of the Gothic, these atmospheric details are an essential part of the pleasure of the genre. It made me wonder, this is sort of what started this whole project, is like, what might we take from their seeming relegation here to the mundane? Why call them mundane and then infuse your books with them? Right, so perhaps on the one hand, there's an acknowledgement that the Gothic has become conventional, right? That the readers are too comfortable in their assumptions about what the Gothic means, and that we should be alert, right, to the ways that McGuire's series seeks to unsettle those fundamental assumptions, to make legible through Gothic tropes something and different elements that are rarely associated with the Gothic, but that are, you know, in conversation with our current context, as the Gothic always is, but also fundamentally at home within that Gothic, and that's an asexual Gothic. One of the ways that McGuire signals this is through the heavy use of Gothic tropes, right? Like the two tableaux quoted above. Like, this series is deeply invested in exploring the nature of storytelling, and Gothic storytelling in particular, and the tropes of all of the genres, though, that McGuire is drawing from. And they're often apparent in metatextual moments and allusions, right? So for instance, we're going into book one now, and there will definitely be spoilers throughout this next section for book one. The headmistress of the school for children who have gone through the magical portals and returned to our world is described as, quote, "the kind of stolid elderly aunt who only really existed in children's stories." Narration is identified as a way to approach the experiences of the children and teens. Quote, "narrate the impossible things, turn them into a story, and they could be controlled." And right before Nancy, our sort of protagonist of this first novella, finds her doorway again at the end of that book, she repeats the mantra, quote, "nobody gets to tell me how my story ends but me," willing the doorway into existence with her desire to return to the halls of the dead. And we'll come back to those halls in a moment. And certainly readers of this series will know this is not her end, but right, it's the end of this book. So this highly self-conscious storytelling frame draws attention to the allusions and intertexts used by McGuire to firmly situate her novels within a Gothic tradition of writing, like quite intentionally, right? So from references to a student who spent basically a decade living in a Hammer film, to the overdetermined connection between the moors, where Jack and Jill traveled, and as I mentioned earlier, with the 19th century Gothic of Frankenstein and Dracula, to the reference to the Addams family in relation to the twins. And I mean, these are merely a couple. Certainly, if you're a fan of the series and have others to throw in, please do that in the comments. But basically what all of these things are doing, all of these allusions to well-known Gothic media and works and whatnot, is that it's signaling a relationship to the genre, but it's also showing McGuire's awareness of the complex history of this genre, which is essential to how she then shapes an asexual Gothic in her first book. So I want to turn now to that first novella, Every Heart a Doorway, which centers on an openly asexual character, Nancy, to explore how that book makes legible an asexual identity within this Gothic frame, upon which then McGuire can extend asexuality into the heart of the Gothic literary tradition. Thus, sort of expanding our understanding really of the genre itself by making a place within it for asexual people, desires, and themes. So let's talk about Nancy. Many of Nancy's early interactions with her classmates at the school are used to actually make very clear her romantic asexuality and the operations of a society that's dominated by an ideology of compulsory sexuality, though of course McGuire doesn't use those terms. And while those depictions may feel a little on the nose at times, I think her explicitness early on is actually necessary to make legible a sexuality that, as explored earlier, is notoriously subject to erasure in both heterosexual and queer discourse. Thus, when Nancy makes the decision to be open about her asexuality with her new friends, she's forced to explain herself in multiple ways before they understand. Resisting her roommate Sumi's assumption, inframed by compulsory sexuality, that Nancy must either want to have sex with the beautiful trans boy Cade or Nancy's female roommate Sumi, Nancy explains, that is, I don't do that with anyone. Further elaborating when Sumi again assumes that means she is celibate, quote, no, celibacy is a choice. I'm asexual. I don't get those feelings. And then later, when she's alone in the woods with Cade, her thoughts sort of further explain her feelings to the reader. This was always the difficult part, explaining that asexual and aromantic were different things. She liked holding hands and trading kisses. Cade was possibly the most beautiful boy she'd ever seen. She wanted to spend hours sitting with him and talking about pointless things. She wanted to feel his hand against her skin, to know that his presence was absolute and focused entirely on her. The trouble was, it never seemed to end there, and that was as far as she was willing to go. So McGuire needs to be explicit about the shape of Nancy's asexuality, describing her aesthetic attraction and desire for physical intimacy unconnected to sex, to make a space for her character in a genre most often driven by sexual desire and its excesses. What's fascinating to me is that McGuire takes this carefully drawn asexuality and centers it fundamentally in the Gothic. Nancy's portal world is the halls of the dead, an underworld realm associated with pomegranates and the myth of Persephone, with all of their connotations of sexuality, both illicit and in many versions violent, with black, white, and gray pre-Raphaelite style aesthetic, so a very 19th century romantic aesthetic of the Gothic, and with denizens who, as the narrator describes it, quote, lusted as hotly as the living did. Yet Nancy feels at home there in a way that she doesn't anywhere else, immediately implying room within the Gothic for asexuality, both as a sexuality and as an interpretive lens. And so while Nancy's romantic asexuality is certainly important in its own right, as representation and visibility for one type of sexuality within the ace spectrum, it's the more subtle unsettling of assumptions about the Gothic genre that I want to think about as McGuire connects her characters' struggle for legibility against ideologies of compulsory sexuality with readerly, and as I mentioned earlier, critical assumptions about a sexually infused Gothic. She does this by creating a constant tension between tropes and images with strong sexual resonances and a disavowal of those resonances. And I want to give one example of this, but there are actually many in the novellas. This is just sort of one that I think will be most clear. So thus, When Every Heart a Doorway ends with the illegibly asexual Nancy finding her door back to her portal world. The narrator concludes as follows, quote, like a key that finds its keyhole, Nancy was finally home. So linking her asexual character to a simile that's steeped in heterosexual resonances. Like key and keyhole has long had that tradition, particularly in literary circles, of being about heterosexual organs, if you will. McGuire is creating with this a disorientation, to borrow Sara Ahmed's concept, which I talk about in more detail in my video on Silver Fox in Malazan Book of the Fallen. But sort of this disorientation that actually what it's doing is making visible the orientation we're bringing to the Gothic genre by unsettling that interpretive frame, thus putting the burden of the sexual connotations of that image firmly onto the reader, right? Like if in this context, we're pushed to read that image as a sexual image, despite everything we know about Nancy up to this point, that is on us. That is on our own assumptions, both about sort of society and sexuality, perhaps, but also about the genre. Nancy also has a variety of qualities that link her to the vampire figure, right? So she's an aversion to the sun, very pale skin, sort of unhuman stillness. She drinks pomegranate juice, explicitly linked to blood in the text. But these are all aesthetic rather than bodily, right? Making her more akin to a statue or a painting than the monstrous vampire figure. And in fact, in the Halls of the Dead, she is a living statue. So I'm still working on these ideas right now, so it's not fully fleshed out yet. But McGuire's emphasis on Nancy as aesthetic in nature, a fact that's sort of tied as well to her ability to radically slow down her bodily processes and her lack of appetite for food, which seems to be actually a quality that's becoming associated with asexual Gothic representations, as we see it in Drew's novel as well. Okay, I lied. One more reference to that novel. But yes, this creates a sort of a Gothic that's removed from the body, that's invested in a distinct type of Gothic beauty, but that which remains surface and aesthetic rather than sexual, but which is treated as something valued and as a valid identification in the novellas that feature Nancy. And so one of the examples that show this sort of different type of Gothic and that link is when we have this link made between pomegranate juice and blood. So while she's in the Halls of the Dead, Nancy exists almost entirely on pomegranate juice, whose color and, of course, propensity to stain the skin provide obvious connections to blood. However, the sustenance is made aesthetic in its method of delivery, being carefully squeezed from sponges into the mouths of the living statues, of whom Nancy is one, and it's in its role as the only color other than black and white allowed to be worn by the hall's living inhabitants. The book as well, though, extends this aesthetic of the pomegranate juice to blood. So when Nancy comes upon an injured Jack, we get the following lines, quote, "She had forgotten how much like pomegranate juice a blood stain could look in the right light. She had forgotten how beautiful it was." And so notice there that connection between the blood of the Gothic, of the vampire, of a sort of bodily monstrousness, desire, sexual desire, and all of those things, with the pomegranate juice, which is in itself, thin, right? Even what's being chosen, the thickness of blood versus the thinness of pomegranate juice, is being brought together to make that connection between the Gothic, but to almost disembody it, to flatten it out, to make it different and no longer monstrous in the way we're used to understanding monstrous Gothic bodies, right? Arguably, this is still monstrous in some ways, and certainly Nancy is sort of feared by some of the other kids at the school because of her relationship to death in the Halls of the Dead, but because she's the center, of course, the reader is meant to be on her side. And thus, sort of like Nancy's aesthetic attraction to Cade, the beautiful boy, and her love of Preraphylite clothing, her relationship to blood is one of aesthetic appreciation, not desire or repulsion. Linking Nancy's lack of sexual desire and her lack of appetite for food with her romantic asexuality, which, in Reddit spaces you might refer to as like an aesthetic attraction, demonstrates a space within the Gothic tradition for asexual subjects and readings, for a darkness that is cold and alien to life, but not through its excess or passionate desire, through its refusal to conform to either the social pressures to define oneself as primarily a sexual being, or the genre pressures to reveal some deep monstrosity within, however that monstrosity is defined, and to sort of anchor that within a sort of bodily decay or dissolution. So that's it for me. Basically, to wrap things up, in the Wayward Children series, right, McGuire is bringing the asexual into the heart of Gothic tradition, right? She's unsettling readerly assumptions about the nature of the Gothic and about sexuality itself by making legible asexuality as a challenge to ideas of compulsory sexuality that run throughout our society and our literary tradition. So in some ways, she's very much confirming the critical stance that the Gothic is always about and in relation to our current moment, the taboos of that moment, the elements that are not meant to be spoken or are not accepted within that dominant hegemony in terms, in particular, again, of sexuality as well, right? And so it's actually incredibly appropriate in a time when, certainly compared to the 19th century, there is more acceptance of different types of sexual identity. Although, of course, I'm well aware of what's happening in the States and that being rolled back, which is thoroughly disgusting. But I think it makes sense that now is a time when we also, are allowing asexuality into that tradition, which also makes sense because in some ways it's at the root of the Gothic tradition as well. Certainly, Horace Walpole is legible as, for 21st century readers, is legible as an asexual or a gay man, right? At the very most, definitely a queer man in terms of his society's times. So in some ways, bringing asexuality into the Gothic is going right back to its earliest literary traditions and its earliest sort of literary makers and authors. So if you got this far, thank you for watching. If you have questions, comments, other thoughts about the Gothic, other thoughts about asexuality, please do put them below. If you want a video on Jill, the wannabe vampire, let me know for sure. I mean, I might do it anyway, depending on how my research is going, because this is such a fun topic. And otherwise, just thank you for watching.